Should be good.
Okay, so I'm here to talk about research. And I think that there's a very easy answer to the question, which is like, why do debaters do research? Which is that, oh, well, we have to. Whether like your team makes you do research or you do it for your own enjoyment. But I think the harder question to answer is like, how can you do research effectively? Because everybody that I've like talked to in debate like has a different way that they like to go about doing research or different sources they like to use depending on like what style of debate they do. Like you're certainly not going to find K cards on the best sources for law reviews or like courts affirmatives. So I broke up. I basically went through a bunch of different AFs and politics disads and like K answer cards that I've cut over the years, and I compiled a list of tons and tons of sources, and then broke all of them up as well as some general research notes into a couple of different sections. Um, so the first section is search terms before we get into talking about specific pieces of evidence. The second one, I'm going to talk about the like hierarchy of best sources versus stuff that you should stay away from. Then I'm going to talk about some of my favorite places to cut cards from, and then we'll talk about AF places you can look for AFs, places you can look for neg generics, and places you can look for K research. And then I'll bring it all together in the end for a little bit of a conclusion. So um, when you start doing research on a topic or when you start doing research generally about any specific issue, I think that it's always important to have search terms first. And the way you would do this if you're writing an affirmative is you go look at T cards or like the core legislation of the topic. And if you are doing this from a negative perspective, you want to start by thinking about what affirmatives you're trying to answer or the general area of the topic and to use search terms that a lot of AF evidence or topic wording uses. So Clara in her AF lecture yesterday talked about how you want to use words like water resources or federal because those can direct you in the area of some federal key warrants. Something that I like to do is I take the words from the T cards that are most likely to be like the most limited version of the topic. So like a good example would be like um, the like Pearson evidence from the arms sales topic, or like I don't know what what the best most limited version of the topic on this one is. Maybe some of the T regulate cards, like the um, Salone evidence. Those you could take the words like regulate from those, or you can look at the specific legislation that they're citing. Those are all good places to look for search terms. And a lot of this, well, as I've been doing AF research on this topic, I think the best search terms that I've found so far are just the general area that you're looking for. So when I was doing RFS research for the affirmative that we wrote at Michigan, using the words RFS and LCFS because those were the two pieces of legislation that had the biggest impact on the affirmative, as well as federal, states, in order to think about how I wanted to answer like the states counter plan, as well as like search terms that were used in the literature a lot. So something that was used in literature a lot was like an ethanol mandate or different types of agricultural products that was mandated by the RFS. And so before you like get down and write your plan and you start cutting cards for your AF, like Clara said yesterday, it's a good idea to have a master of the search terms. And if you're looking for negative research against affirmatives, it's a lot of the same process, but you're going to want to start it from the opposite direction. You're going to want to start thinking about, okay, so the affirmative has probably parsed through a lot of the law reviews or the articles that talk about the federal government's role. So if I want to cut a state's counterplan versus this affirmative, I want to look up examples of states that have like done something similar to the action of the affirmative, or I want to look at the sources that the affirmative has cut their cards from to see if there are other authors that are advocating that maybe a more local version of the affirmative would be better. So using search terms like local, different state mechanisms as well, like zoning laws, are ways that you can find advocates for states' counterplans against affirmatives. And also, if you're looking for disadvantage links, using words like controversy or political capital, or like um, one word that I see like all the time is like the political economy, which is this like word that a bunch of law students use to like describe the way that bills get passed, and a lot of the articles that talk about the political economy talk about the controversy of the affirmatives. That's a good place to start, like some politics links. And I'll talk more about the politics to sad later and how to do research for that. But generally, you don't start doing research by starting and going and cutting cards. You start doing research by first figuring out the search terms that you want after you've started doing that research for your new disad or counterplan or affirmative. So, what are like the best places to cut cards? I've got my search terms and I've got, like my list of different searches that I've been doing, but what should I look for and what should I prioritize? So, I think, generally in debate, it's a good idea to stay away from D rules, but if there is a D rule that I would support in debate, it would be the idea that books are always the best cards. If you can find a book about the controversy area that you are dealing with, most of the time those cards are going to be A plus. They're always edited by people with very high academic qualifications, and they almost always use dozens and dozens and dozens of cited evidence and other work. Um, so they're going to be the most, they also use the most colorful language, which is nice in debate because it's, ethosy and supports our argument better if it has colorful language. um, and books generally just have the most academic rigor put into them when they're written. So books are certainly the best place that I would say to cut cards from, but it's also hard because you can't find a book for every card that you want in debate. So when you're looking for other pieces of evidence, you should always prioritize those that have uh, credible evidence cited in them within them, which most often comes from people with higher academic qualifications. Some good place to find those authors writing in like law professors or like students teaching graduate classes is like amicus briefs, which I'll talk about later when we get into affirmatives writing, law reviews, as well as journals. There is like basically a journal for everything on the planet, and people have started proliferating so many academic journals that they're starting to name themselves ridiculously long names, like the Journal of Biophysical Sustainability and Resource Quality. Like, it's sort of almost Rule 34. If there is an idea that you have for something in debate, there is certainly a journal that has a card for it that supports it. And those are always the ones that have more academic rigor supported with them and the most peer reviewed evidence that goes into them. Next down on the hierarchy, I would certainly say, is just any general website that you would find in your Google search that has some sort of a qualified author attached to it. Most of the time, this is where you'd be looking if you're looking for like politics cards or just a piece of evidence that isn't going to be like game changing in your 1AC, but you need a piece of evidence to like answer a disad or to answer an affirmative advantage. Um, Generally doing just general Google searches and like making sure that those authors at least have some form of qualification tied to them. And then obviously below that would be any person who, maybe they just went to college for 4 years, got a degree, they write for like the New York Times or the Post or something, would be next on the list. So those are all general sources that I would say have good qualifications and are good to cut stuff from. But some of the worst sources to cut cards from and the things that I would strongly advise that you stay away from, first is like thesis papers. These are okay for like some critical, or if you want to get into like a really obscure area of critical research, thesis papers are sometimes the absolute best to do that. But also, if you're doing policy research, they are almost never policy specific. They are always written by a certainly underqualified person, and they're hundreds of pages long, most of which is simply analyzing the status quo. So I would stay away from thesis papers. There are sometimes some diamonds in the rough, but it's unlikely to find those in thesis papers. Another thing I would hedge to stay away from is personal blogs. So if you ever find like an author's own website, so like, I don't know, like johnu.com or something, those are really, really hit or miss because a lot of the times they are like they're good cards. They have the language that you want and they support the argument, but it's a facade because most of the time the reason why they have to write it on a personal blog is because they couldn't get it published somewhere else, or it's like such a hot take in their area of study that like there is no chance that they would be able to take it to like a publisher and get it published. So like it's okay to cut some cards from these areas, but I would also hedge against them because other teams can call you out and be like, yo, this person is writing for their own website, like there's obviously like if it was had that level of academic rigor, they could have got it published somewhere else. And the last area that I would stay away from is like, I guess I'll do another Egan call out here. Egan reads like these like crazy framing contentions about like the natural log of E and like these mathematical equations and high and data and stuff. These are really like helpful and they give you like some ethos moments a lot when you're like, yo, look at this insane data set that we just produced into and inserted into the debate. And so it's really awesome to like have this moment where you're like, we've got the power of science and data. And then like the judge looks at what you've put in the doc, and it is the most incomprehensible tangle of random math equations and calculus. Uh, yeah, no, I was Eric. I was talking about the natural log of e. It's like a huge ethos moment where you're like, we've got math on our side. We did the math for you, and then you look at the equation and you're like, oh wait, I don't know what this means. I've never taken calculus. I don't know how to evaluate this. Like, so, and it's not just like the math equations. A lot of times there's a lot of like the highest of end journals have like these crazy physics professors writing in them, and a lot of the times they're very inconclusive because the data set is so huge where they're like, we got some results that say this and we got some results that say this and we really just don't know, like we need to do future research. So I would stay away from those. They're often super confusing, and even if you spend the time to take hours to understand what they're talking about, it's not going to be comprehensible in like a 1 hour and 30-minute debate to a judge who's never seen the subject before. Okay, so next section is just going to be some general areas that I like to do searches on, whether I'm doing neg research, AF research, or just looking into search terms or topic stuff in general. My absolute favorite place to search. It's certainly more policy oriented, but I cut and write policy apps, so it's the place that I spend the most time researching on is Hein Online. It is like one of my favorite things ever. It's just a massive collection of law journals, most of which you can't find doing a normal Google search. And oh yeah, the link. Yeah,
I can put it in the chat.
yeah, yeah, I saw that. And also I would say a caveat there that a lot of them are hidden behind paywalls, but what I would do is I would look, do Google like quote unquote Google searches just in the Hein Online database. And if you find something that you like or you find something you think would be promising, if you just re-Google the title of the article, then most of the time it pops up without a paywall on it. So Hein Online is just a good way to that all of those are collected together. So I start my searches there, but if something is behind a paywall, I'll just re-Google it and all the time it comes up. So it's just a huge collection of law reviews and journals and congressional testimonies. Uh, Congressional testimonies are like, yeah, the DOI number as well, the Sci-Hub search. I have a section later on where I talk about quote unquote illegal places to search. So we'll get there to Sci-Hub. But yeah, it's just congressional testimonies are one of the most underrated places to cut cards from, I think. Like like Trufanov's NFU AF is like 50% congressional testimonies from the college executive topic, and uh, the Kasparov card that is like the really good democracy impact card that people have read forever is like some random chess player writing and talking in front of like a Congress session. So uh, a lot of the time their language is kind of boring, but there are some really, really, really good cards hidden in congressional testimonies. Yeah, Gary Kasparov. Okay, next place is LexisNexis. I think it's called Nexus Uni now. This one is normally only a service that's provided by universities. But if you have access to a university library, or if you have access to the search engine, but like so like you can search on Hein online without having a subscription to it. I think maybe you can do the same thing with LexisNexis, and you can just re-Google the articles once you find them. The reason why I think this is helpful is that it's just a combination of everything that you wouldn't normally find through a Google search. And you can specify your searches. So LexisNexis has normal articles, it has like government documents, it has law reviews, and you can click which one you want. So Hein Online is very good for like law reviews, and it's very good for congressional testimonies. But if you want to broaden your search towards more general articles as well, LexisNexis is a great place to do that. It also helps for finding articles that are in academic journals but are not in law reviews, which I think I talked about earlier. And then the last one, this is like easiest. Everybody has access to this. It is a really, really good source. Even if not as good, it is accessible to everyone, and it produces the same quality of evidence as just plain old classic Google Scholar. I would uh I would say that it's when you search on Google Scholar, it's important to use the date function, because like half of the searches that I do on Google Scholar the first time come up with stuff from like the 80s and 70s. So using the date function on the side of Google Scholar is important. And we're not in an international relations or foreign affairs topic right now, but I did put together a list of a lot of the places that are good for those topics, because I'm sure that I think we'll have one next year if I'm not mistaken on high school, and they happen all the time in college. So I'll just go through these really fast because I don't think any of them have any particular advantage to one another, but they're all very good generally for both sides of the foreign policy debate. Would be foreign affairs, foreign policy, the MIT Press, CSIS, which is like the Center for Security and International Studies, and War on the Rocks. Those are all places that showcase both sides of like the restraint versus engagement alliances and like different doctrines of foreign policy that are all helpful to get into. That's not particularly relevant on this topic, but it could be for the future. Okay, so next section is AF research. Uh, there's three sub points, which is Congress AFs, executive AFs, and courts AFs. I'm going to go through the general way that I would do research for these types of furnaces, and then talk about specific sources that are better or worse for these. Could you make a list of those later and send it to the doc? The foreign policy ones? Yeah, I can just send that right now. There you go. Send it in the Discord. Yeah, I can send out all these notes in the Discord too. After. Okay, so AF research specifically, I'll start with Congress ones. If I want to write a Congress AF, if I've done my preliminary research and I think that there is, for the problem that I'm trying to solve, we'll say like climate change, for example, and I'm like, okay, Congress has some good mechanisms like cap and trade or carbon tax. Let me go and figure out the solvency advocates for those. So first place I always like to look is Hein Online. Look at congressional testimonies, because a lot of the times when people talk on in front of Congress, they're most of the time asking Congress to do something. So there's a lot of good Congress keywords when you search on congressional testimonies. The Harvard Journal of Legislation, I think it's legislation and policy, or policy and legislation. is a journal that Harvard puts out yearly, and it includes tons of articles that are written by like famous scholars throughout the country on like generally issues that have been untouched and need updated by the legislature. They have very, very good Congress key warrants. Um, a lot of the solvency advocates that were written for like the natives AF this year, as well as like Glenbrook North's like weird AF about like law enforcement in the military was written in this journal. The Sarah Deer article came from the Harvard Journal of Legislation. So those are two places that are good for Congress affirmatives, and also looking and doing searches with the key terms of congressional only functions. So power of the purse, funding, treaties. Those are things that only Congress can do. And so if you use those functions or use those those functions as search terms when looking for those affirmatives, those are helpful. Okay, next is executive affirmatives. I don't think I've ever like gone out doing affirmative research looking specifically for an executive mechanism. Probably because last year there was a really terrible case for executive affirmatives being included in the topic. Um, but I think that if you do want to write one, the the undisputed best place to look is to find the agency that most commonly deals with the issue that you are trying to fix. So on this topic, it would most likely be the EPA, or from the topic lecture, he talked about the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management. And if you look through their like past rules and like agency adjudications or whatever on their website, you just go to their website and there's a section where you can look for their past rules. And if you click on any one of those rules, you can always find the notice and comment part, which is a legally required process in the agency rulemaking process. And a lot of the times, tons of super qualified scholars will be writing for the EPA about whether or not this rule is a good or a bad idea. It's also a great place to do negative research if you're trying to find tricky ways to write a case specific strategy against an executive affirmative. Would be looking at these notice and comment letters that get sent to the EPA from like professors and people who've had experience in the government about a specific issue. And then another one, but one that's quite smaller, is like I know Clara talked a little bit yesterday about like the executive flexibility debate, but the law review where this like originated from is like the Valparaiso. Here, I can't pronounce it, but that's how you spell it. Law review, and they're the ones who like originally published like John Yu's crazy ramblings, and like Robert Blomquist is this guy who like agrees with John Yu, and so they write a ton about the functions of the executive on that law review that would be a place to look. It's certainly not as good as like agency rules, but it is a potential promising place. Okay, so the final section of AF research is courts affirmatives. Undisputed, like hands down, absolute best place to cut cards from these is amicus briefs, which is similar to the EPA notice and comment thing I talked about, is just a function where professors can write to a court and tell them the significance of what it would mean for ruling one way for or another. So like I read an affirmative on the and the best place to find those is just go to SCOTUS blog, which is a blog for the Supreme Court, because they always post them there. So I read an affirmative on the CGR topic that was a court staff, and it was written almost entirely about a past court case that the Supreme Court had decided, and it was written all from amicus briefs that professors had sent to the court. A lot of the times they have a huge stake in the outcome of the case, so they write really passionate and colorfully worded cards to courts about which way they should rule, and they're just like they're ideal debate cards because they use a lot of the same language that we use in debate. A case text is a website where you can search past court decisions. I think cutting cards from like justices on lower courts is also an underrated place to find cards. like I would advise you against cutting cards from the Supreme Court, but a lot of like um, justices on lower courts write really good opinions on court cases that are a great place to cut cards. And then a similar source to Hein Online, but one that is more tailored to court cases is ProQuest, which is like a law oriented. It also deals with like some international law stuff and the function of courts search database that allows you to look into specific cases as well as to you can there's a way you can get free case text, which I if you Discord DM me, I'll tell you how. And so ProQuest is just a similar way as Hide Online, but it's more tailored specifically to court cases in the court. Okay, so before I move on to the next section, which is a little bit shorter, but it's just neg research, I guess I'll open up to questions. And I'll actually go see if I can find this case text thing. Oh, okay, yeah. So what I did to get free case text stuff is you have to, if you find a court case that you're interested in getting the opinions from, you can search it on case text and then it'll allow you to like get it free once. But the service doesn't have a limit on how many times you can get it free. So as long as you have a specific issue that you're looking into, you can get it free every time. And also if you can't find it on case text or if case text is blocking you and says you need to pay, you can also Google the name of the court case, and a lot of the times courts will just publish them free on their websites. Uh, is court evidence only relevant for T? It's certainly a good place to look for T cards because courts are the ones who define the words, but like court opinions about cases are also a very good source to cut like AF cards from. So like the same affirmative example as the one that we read last year. We also had a card in the 1AC that was from a judge who was like, this case is the deciding factor as to whether or not we abandon like Fourth Amendment protections for people. Um, it is hit or miss sometimes, though I will agree with you. But it's helpful for writing affirmatives and it's helpful for doing T research. Okay. If anybody else has a question, you can unmute, type it in the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to neg policy research. Okay, cool. So a lot of the same sources will apply to doing neg research, but you'll want to do it in the opposite direction, like I mentioned at the beginning. So when you're normally doing affirmative research, you'll want to be using keywords about things that can beat negative positions. So federal, or like what the states, if the states have been struck down in the past. That type of language is good for doing affirmative research, but you want to do it opposite on the negative. So you'll want to find examples of states having already done the affirmative or um, looking at different AF specific mechanisms. The best way to do this, and it's a little bit of like a cop out answer, but it's like if you go to the AF's sources and you look at who they're citing, a lot of the times you can find people on the opposite side of the debate. And that gives you a starting point and some search terms to look for. I talked about some search terms for the state's counterplan earlier, but the absolute like hardest thing to answer from an affirmative perspective, and if you really want to beat a team's affirmative, if you go and get in depth into their affirmatives literature, you can find a lot of times AF specific disads or AF specific counterplans. Uh, and these are really hard to answer, and they're always found in the literature of an affirmative. So the best way to find those is to look at who people are citing. And once you get a basis for those opposite search terms, it gets exponentially easier as you get deeper and deeper into the affirmatives literature. Now, that's probably not sustainable for an entire season. You can't do AF specific research for every single case. It's way too much work. So the best way to do generic research is to think of the way that I found it helpful in the past, especially doing like neg policy generics, is to think of Um, like counterplan mechanisms that have been used on past topics or counterplan mechanisms that have already been written and think about ways you can change them. So, for example, if you were to say, all right, we've got our states counterplan that normally does the affirmative, but for apps that have like really, really good Fed key warrants, we could probably get some reasons as to why the states could do like an advantage counterplan. And so having like in-depth research on files that like of functions that the states can do to solve impacts as opposed to um, like specific affirmatives is a good place to start. Looking at state initiatives in the past, normally if you go to like a state legislature's website, a lot of the times they will have ordinances from this term. Term is the correct word, I think, and you can look and see what they've done. You can also get into state in-depth literature by looking at local sources. So, like in Kansas, there's the Kansas City Star is the newspaper here, and people write articles in it about what the legislature is doing. Those are good sources to find. You can also to find like actions that state governments have done that can be solvency advocates for affirmatives, solvency advocates for advantage counterplans, or maybe even state politics disads. And the last thing I'll talk about is neg research is like uh, when people write AF cards and when people write law reviews, I would say 65% of the time they're responding to somebody. And so if you can go find the person that they were responding to and find that area of research that that person was getting into, then it is a great place to start. Okay. And then last section is K research. I will caution I'm not an expert on K research, especially from the neg perspective. I mostly only cut AF answers to Ks. But I have picked up a couple of tricks and good places to look if you are getting into K research as I've been doing it. So the quote unquote D rule that I applied earlier would still apply here, which is that books are always and absolutely the best place to cut K cards from. They cite the most people, they have the most sources, and they go through the most academic rigor. They also have the time to set up large theories about what their ideas are trying to support. Whereas if they're writing in journals, most of the time they're writing about more specific issues, which can be helpful for like AF specific links. But if you are starting from the ground up and you're trying to build like your like a K theory that hasn't been discovered yet, or if you're trying to recut and rediscover a lot of old literature so that you understand it yourself, it's helpful to start with the core books before going outwards and searching in to other people's branched out ideas from a theory. So if you're getting into like the Afro-pessimism literature, always the best place to start is like the 2010 Wilderson book and then branch out. And the same thing with other areas of like debate theory. So like if you're getting into like the securitization stuff, like start with like the 90s like McDonald books before going further in time. So I mentioned earlier that master's theses or like undergraduate theses are like a bad place to cut policy cards. I would still say that there are better sources to cut K cards, but some of the best like neg K cards that I've found are from master's theses and people writing like undergraduate degrees. A lot of the time, they're kind of like traps a little bit. So I would watch out because sometimes they're like citing people who are wholly not even talking about the like vein of theory that you're trying to get into, but the language that they use is much, much, much more powerful than a lot of the average pieces of evidence that you will find doing K research. So it's a good place to look after you've started with core materials. And I said this before, but it's even more applied here is if you have a book that supports the general theory that you're looking into, searching the book title on Google Scholar and going to the cited by is a great idea to find people who are supporting your theory and also to get ahead of the affirmative by looking and already finding a lot of the AF pieces of evidence that could be criticizing your theory so that you're ready to answer them. Um, for AF, answers to criticisms. Uh, the cited by feature is like a lifesaver. It allows you to find like theory specific cards that can be found in journals and books. Um, and also, the more AF specific it gets, the better. So if you go to the cited by and you collect a bunch of search terms from a negative theory, and then you do some searches that are specific to the affirmative that you're reading, a lot of the times you can find people who have analyzed the issue that you are trying to solve with your affirmative or the specific legal issue through the theory that the negative is going to use to criticize your AF. And so finding some perm cards by doing research through their theory, or uh, even like cards that can link turn the K through their theory, are helpful to have on the affirmative. There's a bunch of good death penalty cards on last year's topic that were specific to a lot of abolition veins of literature that all like cited like Michelle Alexander and prominent abolitionists. I would watch out for a couple of things though. One, you should always make sure that your answer to the K actually says what you think it says, because I've seen a lot of people like cut neg links to their AF, and then they read them as link turns and they don't know, or they read them as link turns, but they don't know that it's actually a link to the K. And a lot of K authors will criticize other K authors as well. And so like the example I wrote down in my notes is like, you should stay away from like veins of critical literature that would not support the affirmative, even if they criticize the negative's position. Like if you're reading a big stick policy app, like a psychoanalytic K of like security studies is not going to do anything for you, because it probably reciprocally links to your policy app. And then lastly, I have a couple of good search areas for AF and neg specific K research. ResearchGate is free. It's online search database where you can find lots of journal articles that have been published or and were uploaded there by the authors, or that haven't been published. Uh, hey, I'm getting there. I'm getting there. And academia.edu is a similar place where authors can upload their own work for peer research. And I forgot to mention this earlier, but a similar thing where authors upload their own stuff for like legal issues is SSRN. Okay, final general tips. I do not endorse using these, but if you absolutely cannot find a article or a book that you are really looking for, if you have the DOI number, you go to sci-hub.se, and if you have the book title, go to libgen.is. Or don't go to those if you have that number, obviously, because it's illegal. And then last couple of tips that I have: always look at footnotes, look at works cited, because those are good places to expand your research. And you should always expand on your category of search terms that you are pulling from as you continue to do research. Yeah, we don't endorse Sci-Hub or LibGen. We're simply giving them to you so you know what to stay away from. All right, there you go. There's my notes on research. I can send out these notes. I can also just compile all of the like databases that I think and have found helpful and send those out as well if people would like. So yeah, I guess I'm good for questions if anybody has questions, or if anybody has like research thoughts, you can certainly spin them off me.
I have a question. Um, so how many hours per week or per day or whatever mechanism you want to use should I spend time researching, or just like use your personal experience as a reference?
Yeah, good question. So it depends on like, and like the time you spend on debate in general should always depend on what else you have going on. So I would say as like before you start thinking about how to uh, piece up the time that you do spend on debate, you should think about the other issues. So like schoolwork. Many people have always told me that that comes before, as well as like, the relationships that you have with your friends and family are important to be maintained. And so once you have an idea of how much time you like or you want to spend on debate, I would say, hmm, I think other people should certainly give their opinions on this, but I would say that I spend probably like 50 to 60% of the time that I'm just like practicing or like working on debate is doing research, and then the other like 50-40% of the time is like doing speech redos, doing practice rounds, talking with my partner and coaches and stuff. But yeah, other people should answer that question too, because I would say that I do more research.
Then how much time do you spend writing blocks?
Yeah, I would say like writing blocks is included in like that 50-60 like research time, but if I had to split that up, um hmm, me personally, I probably spend like 10% of that time during the season, but like in the preseason when you're first putting together all your generics and you're first putting together your affirmatives, it's a significantly larger amount of that time, especially once you've gathered all of your cards and stuff and you're ready to make like your disad file, your counterplan, your K, or your 2AC blocks and stuff. But yeah, that is a really good question. I will admit I'm not the most qualified person to answer that, because there are some times where I just know life in my room. And
Um, so another question is like you say on the court cases, like if you want to research a court case, um, it will have that website. But one, like how do I know what court case to research before I research it? And two, for specific words like resource or water, how would you specifically look at those court cases and where do you know to find those court cases?
yeah, so a lot of the sources that you'll find on like Hein Online or just doing general searches on Google Scholar, when they produce law reviews, a lot of law reviews are written about court case results. So I'll use the AF that I read last year as an example again. There was a court case in like 94 or something that basically said it was legal for police officers to like stop and search your car if they thought that you did something illegal, even like commit a traffic violation. Um, and there have been a bunch of law reviews that have been written about this court case. And the way that I found the idea for the AF and started doing research for the AF was I read a law review about police misconduct that cited the court case as an example. And the court case name was like Wren v. US. And so I was like, okay, that's interesting. Let me Google the court case. And, it came up with like how it had affected uh, like police conduct over the years as well as other court decisions. And as I read more sources about it, I found court cases, or I found more law reviews that were like, hey, this precedent has been applied in this court case, it's been applied in this court case. And actually, there's an ongoing court case that it's been being applied in, and it has determinations for the future of the court decision. And its name was like, I think it was Randy Johnson for United States. And so I looked it up on SCOTUS blog, which is the place that I would say is like the best for finding amicus briefs. And I downloaded a lot of the amicus briefs and I read them, and they were all like, yeah, this implicates the Wren decision. It's all connected to like this police misconduct stuff. So I was like, okay, this is a great place to like cut cards for the 1AC, or like cut cards about the issue in general. So I understand, like, you don't start doing court case research by Googling like random water resource court cases. Generally, what I would say is you want to read very broad and descriptive law reviews about the topic. So like you'll want to read the cards about like division between the federal government and states over water policy, or like the federal government's role in water resources. And as you read those law reviews, the names of court cases will come up, and you can branch off into those court cases as well. And so that would be my answer to like how do you start finding court cases. I don't remember the second part of the question. Could you repeat it, please?
So like I guess I'll phrase it like this: if I want to find like an abusive definition of protection, where would I start?
Okay. An abusive definition of protection. So the first thing I would do is I would go to the T cards that have already been put out in like a camp file. And so the most abusive definition of protection, I think, thus far, for the AF at least, is Matnich 96. It's not the most precise definition in the world, but it's definitely very abusive, and it would be hard to be affirmative in that world of the topic. And so if I'm looking for a more abusive definition of protection, I think I would probably start by going to the works cited, see what pieces of legislation. I think the Matnich card is citing like a convention or a treaty on whaling. And so I would go to that convention or that treaty, like Google it. I'd go to the website that has it or like the text of it, and I would see what their definition of protection was. Where did they get that definition from? And I would also go to the sources that have cited Matnich. So I would Google the Matnich law review's name on Google Scholar, and then I would go to the cited by feature to see potentially newer or more restrictive definitions that use the Matnich definition of protection. So to answer your question broadly, like how do you find more T cards? I would start with the ones that have been put out because like people like David Height like have years of experience cutting T cards, and then I would branch out from those sources to find my own cards.
Do we have any more questions? Okay, I'm going to assume that that's a no. All right, thank you so much, John.
Yep.
I'm going to stop the recording.